Hello everyone, I'm Buff English, here to buff up your English skills by giving you all the details you need to know about some of the world's best literature. Today we're discussing Act 2 from William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Act 2 begins with Romeo breaking rule number 1 of the Bro Code: never ditch your friends for a girl. When the Capulet party ends, Romeo is presumably leaving with the same friends he walked in with, including Benvolio and Mercutio, except he's already so enamored with Juliet that he decides to stick around and hide in some bushes while his friends fruitlessly call his name. Then Romeo, in a totally non-creepy way, climbs over the Capulets' orchard wall and stares through Juliet's window. When Juliet appears at her window, Romeo, in a very non-creepy way, stares at her, exclaiming to himself, "But soft! What light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun." Thus begins Romeo and Juliet's famous balcony scene. Although, if we're being honest, there is no actual balcony ever mentioned in this scene, but putting Juliet on a balcony instead of just through a window became a handy way for directors to make Juliet more visible and able to interact with Romeo during this scene. Anyway, as Romeo is spying with heart eyes up at Juliet, it just so happens that at this moment Juliet is looking out into the darkness and saying some of her most famous lines. "Romeo, O Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name." And a little later, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet." What Juliet is really declaring here is, one, that she's in love with Romeo, and two, she recognizes the fundamental challenge they both face in their relationship: their names. Her memorable line about a rose is really calling into question the arbitrary nature of words and names, arguing that if Romeo was called any other name than Montague, he would still be the same Romeo and they could proceed with their relationship uninhibited. This point about their family connections is the first thing the two of them discuss together in this scene, once Romeo, jumps out of the bushes and reveals himself to her. What's interesting about their loving declarations is how quickly they each proclaim their willingness to denounce their families and their names. They don't directly discuss their families or the mutual dilemma they share much more after this, but this foundational understanding of the complicated and not a little dangerous nature of their relationship fuels the childish secrecy they operate under for the rest of the story. What's also interesting to note about this scene is the completely different kinds of interactions the two of them engage in. Almost all of Juliet's lines are stating practical questions or facts, such as, "How did you get in here? And if you get caught by my family, they'll kill you." Contrastingly, like we noted earlier, almost all of Romeo's lines are spoken with a poetic flourish, telling Juliet that he flew over her wall on wings of love, and that her eyes are more dangerous than her family's swords. After the two of them finally swear their love for one another, Juliet brings up the possibility of marriage, which Romeo wholeheartedly affirms. They cutely continue to flirt with and flatter one another, and finally agree that Juliet will send someone to find Romeo the next morning at 9 a.m. After finally dragging himself away from Juliet's window, Romeo makes his way over to Friar Lawrence. We come upon Friar Lawrence as he is greeting the morning out in the field, picking various flowers, and notably, as Romeo approaches, Lawrence picks a flower he knows to be poisonous. Foreshadowing, anybody? The next scene's conversation between Romeo and the friar has always made me laugh, although left me a little confused at the same time. As Romeo begins to tell the friar about having fallen in love with Juliet, Lawrence makes fun of and somewhat scolds Romeo. His first reaction is to say what we all were thinking, which is, "Wow, you were just so dramatic about loving Rosaline and now you love someone else?" And he then concludes with what we all also were thinking: "Young men's love lies then not in their hearts, but in their eyes." He goes off a little bit on Romeo, and when Romeo reminds him that he scolded Romeo for loving Rosaline, Friar Lawrence again reiterates that he scolded him for doting, not for loving, which helps us recognize how different characters are interpreting Romeo's nature. We already saw Benvolio's and Mercutio's responses to Romeo's lovesick drama, and while some, namely Romeo himself, see Romeo as an idealistic romantic experiencing the fullest of what love has to offer, Friar Lawrence here essentially calls Romeo's experiences superficial. But what has always confused me about this scene is Friar Lawrence's ultimate reaction. After spending the entire conversation calling out Romeo for his youthful ignorance about love, he then actually agrees to help Romeo get married. We don't know the extent of the friar's background with Romeo or his family, but the friar appears to be well aware of the perpetual feud between the Montagues and Capulets, and in his thinking, this alliance may so happy prove to turn your household's rancor to pure love. So, okay, his heart is in the right place, but audiences have always questioned the motives and the intellect of Friar Lawrence, since, he is going to secretly wed two teenagers whose families hate each other. To the question, what could go wrong? There is a realm of answers. We then leave the good friar's cell and transition back to the streets of Verona, where Mercutio and Benvolio are hanging out and lamenting how Romeo ditched them last night and broke the bro code. Benvolio also reveals that Tybalt has sent a letter to Romeo, challenging Romeo to a duel. While this seems like a big deal, Mercutio spends most of the conversation complaining about Romeo, saying, "Alas, poor Romeo, he is already dead, stabbed with a white wench's black eye, run through the year with a love song." You get the feeling that Romeo used to be out with his friends and having fun all the time, but now has turned into a love-drunk girl chaser, and Mercutio has taken this quite personally. But as Friar Lawrence already commented, Romeo appears to be in an absolutely wonderful mood, and he does not disappoint in this scene. Romeo shows up, smiling, laughing, and joking, yes, joking, with Mercutio, and we get a glimpse of the boy many in Verona have come to love. Romeo, in fact, is extremely witty with his wordplay in this conversation, and it seems like he has only lately oriented his intellectual attention toward poetic musings rather than joyful dialogue. Mercutio celebrates, saying, "Now art thou sociable, now art thou Romeo, now art thou what thou art." Yes, it seems like Romeo is back. The best part of this scene, though, is when the nurse arrives and the three boys proceed to make fun of her. Well, Romeo and Mercutio do anyway. Benvolio, of course, is too nice and he keeps out of it. The nurse and Romeo then go on to talk together in secret, where Romeo tells her to have Juliet come to Friar Lawrence's later that afternoon to get married. The nurse will bring the message to Juliet, although I like how the chatty nurse slips in there that Paris is seeking Juliet in marriage too, and she has told Juliet that Paris is the properer man. But there's something here too that bothers me about this scene, and that is that the nurse is now the second adult who is aware of Romeo and Juliet wanting to marry, and she aids them in doing so. Is there no one to say, "You just met last night, your families hate each other, let's think this through"? No. The next scene brings the nurse back to Juliet, with a pretty hilarious conversation of Juliet anxiously begging the nurse to tell her what Romeo said and the nurse dragging it out. But finally, once Juliet receives the message, she does indeed join Romeo at Friar Lawrence's that afternoon. Before she arrives, Romeo reverts back to his dramatically poetic notions, speaking of love in extreme terms, for which he earns another chiding from Friar Lawrence. Romeo and Juliet then exchange more loving words and looks and follow Friar Lawrence to go get married. So now Romeo and Juliet have known one another less than 24 hours. No one knows that they're married, and both of their families are still feuding. While there is plenty of discussion with the friar about love and marriage and youth, there is no discussion about, a plan for revealing to the families their union and burying the violence once and for all. In fact, if we consider Tybalt's seething letter to Romeo, Juliet's imminent connection to Paris, and the prince's hovering threat of execution to any would-be brawler, it seems as though Romeo and Juliet's marriage just might complicate things a bit further. So, Act 2 shows our star-crossed lovers steamrolling their way to marriage, come what may. But do you think that marriage really can solve problems between families? Do you think that parents should have a say in who their child dates or marries? Let me know in the comments below, and tune in to Act 3. Romeo and Juliet's story is just getting started, and the best parts are yet to come.